From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at our Books and Beyond Talk. I'm Pam Jackson. I'm director for the Center for the Book, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon for a great conversation that we're going to have. Here at the Center for the Book, we care about and intend on making a lasting, productive, and phenomenal difference in the world of reading, promotion, and literacy. It's like what we care about, what we're focused on, what matters most to us. So we're glad that you're here to join us in the conversations that are ongoing about that. We are a part of the new National and International Outreach Unit at the Library of Congress, whose mission is to share the diverse, vast, rich collections of the library outward and onward. And as a Center for the Book, we have a number of partnerships around the country with reading promotion partners and a network of state centers for the book. Am I not? Yeah? Well, I see a green light. Can you hear me? Volume? Let's see. I'm surprised I'm not loud enough. Yep. No volume control. Okay. So let me try this. Is this better? A little bit better? All right, great. So let me just pick up where I left off, which so part of NIO, so National International Outreach at the Library. We do, I was starting to say this, we have a national network of state centers for the book that also include the District of Columbia and the University and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the Center for the Book administers the Library of Congress Literacy Awards Program, which also has a network of organizations that are award-winning for their best practices in promoting literacy around the world. And we're honored and celebrated a conference just this last week with partners and friends from as far away as Afghanistan and Brazil and New Zealand and Cambodia were here to join us in a conversation promoting reading and literacy. So your presence here today and your viewership online of our webcast is an exciting part and an extension of the promotion partners that we care about, that we consider you a part of our family in. So let me just mention a little bit about what we're here to talk about today, which is an amazing author who's written about an amazing woman. And before I say a little bit about more and introduce her, I want to mention for housekeeping, a couple of housekeeping purposes, and then I'll introduce our speaker. I mentioned this is a webcast, so we're filming for the website. If you do participate in the question and answer portion of our program, you will be recorded and on tape, so we're just giving you the awareness of that. We ask you to take a moment and just check your devices, your mobile devices, that the ringers are off so that we won't have disruption. Another piece, and disrupt the webcasting. Our taping of this author talk is one of more than 250 we have that are online and available at read.gov. We invite you to visit that site as well. With that being said, let me actually talk about our author and our topic today. So the criteria for our Books and Beyond talks is that we are celebrating books and authors who've done research in the Library of Congress collections, or they're writing about the Library of Congress. And today's author has done just that. Louisa Thomas is here to discuss her book, Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Mrs. Adams. And it's an interesting piece that's a very comprehensive biography of our own, only, as I understand, foreign-born First Lady. Louisa Thomas, as the author, has done a number of projects. She's a journalist and an editor and the author of Conscience, Two Soldiers, Two Pacifists, One Family, A Test of Will and Faith in World War I. She's had her writings appear in the New York Times, Vogue, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. She's a contributor to the New Yorker. And what she's written about is an interesting and dynamic woman who's made a real mark in the fabric of our nation. And I consider our author herself the same. So let's welcome Louisa Thomas.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here. It's an honor to be here, especially considering Louisa Catherine Adams' connection to this city and to this spot in particular. As I drove here, I thought of what Louisa must have seen when she drove to Washington for the first time shortly after landing in the United States in 1801 at the age of 26. Her stage drove down dusty turnpikes, past a few scattered clusters of dwellings amid broken plaster, the kilns from the construction still yet to be disassembled. When she passed the Capitol, it was barely an idea, still headless without its dome. There were cows and birds, half-built sandstone buildings already beginning to crumble. Tree stumps rutted the way, which caused danger to her carriage. The area, she later wrote, was a scene of utter desolation. It would become the place where she found her greatest successes and her most painful setbacks. It would be the city where she chose to live out her days and died, home such as she had one. But it would take her a long time to get to that place. Her relationship to the United States was as fraught as the new nation's relationship to itself. She was born in London to a British mother and an American father, and at the age of 9 in 1784, just months after the Revolution, she was made a citizen of Maryland, but that didn't mean much to her then. By the time she reached the United States, she'd already lived in France and Prussia. She'd crossed an ocean and mountains. She'd already seen many things few people of her time could even imagine. But her new home was to her the strangest place she'd ever been. Quincy. What shall I say of my impressions of Quincy? She later wrote of her arrival. Had I stepped onto Noah's Ark, I could not have been more utterly astonished. Her introduction was not exactly auspicious. Abigail Adams, who once called her a siren, found her frail and vaguely foreign, a fine lady, which was not something a good New England housewife was supposed to be. For her part, Louisa was at first intimidated by her resolutely cheerful and industrious mother-in-law, bewildered by the local customs, and overwhelmed by her new duties. She'd later say, "Where was I supposed to have learned to milk a cow? At the card table in the Prussian court?" As it happened, being a fine lady with a canny political intelligence would help her immensely in Washington and the diplomatic world, if not in the barnyard. But the truth was, and I really want to emphasize this, she was frail and she was insecure. And she was far stronger, though, and more resourceful than she first appeared. Let me tell you another story about her. In 1814, at a small post station 12 miles outside of St. Petersburg, Louisa said goodbye to her husband, John Quincy, not knowing when she would see him again. There were tears on her cheeks, tears of distress as well as grief. John Quincy was leaving Russia to negotiate the treaty that would end the War of 1812, and leaving Louisa alone with her 7-year-old son, Charles, in a ruinously expensive city where she did not speak the language and had few friends. She'd just lost a much-loved daughter, and she'd not seen her other 2 young sons for 5 years. Now she was on her own. It would have been hard for anyone, but for Louisa, the prospect was really daunting. Even in the best of times, Louisa often doubted herself. She described herself as timid. She called one of her unpublished memoirs The Adventures of a Nobody. Another was just the record of a life. At the end of the year, John Quincy wrote to Louisa and told her to pack their things and sell them and meet him in Paris. No problem. The trip was nearly 2,000 miles over the half-thawed land devastated by the Napoleonic Wars. She and her tiny son, armed with his toy sword, were on the road for 40 days. And in that time, she was robbed, warned not to continue, told that one of her 2 male servants, whom she hired to protect her, had a local reputation as a, quote, desperate villain. She'd traveled over half-burnt, half-empty villages, over battlefields still strewn with wreckage. She listened to women tell her stories of rampage and rape. Halfway through, she learned that the man behind all this, Napoleon, had escaped Elba and was heading, as she was, toward Paris. Men were mustering, ready for war. Her male servants fled in fear. She, on the other hand, pretended to be Napoleon's sister. At one point, her carriage was surrounded by soldiers. "Tear them out of the carriage," they cried. "Kill them." That was in French, a language she could understand. "Long live Napoleon," she yelled and waved her handkerchief. "Long live." That was all in French, but I'm not going to try. She went on. What was so remarkable to me about that journey is not only how daring it was, it's also what she made of it later in her life. 20 years later, she wrote an account of that trip. She understood that it was not only a good story, but something that she could use to illustrate something of herself, something of her fortitude, her curiosity, her resiliency, something of herself. And it was something she wrote that she could use to show what women could do. She wanted to show that they were not, I think her phrase was, struck by the imbecility that something about the public was always fancying women to have. But she also wanted to show that she was one who was. Those were her words, and she underlined them. That suggests that in her darker moments, she thought she would be forgotten. And for a long time, she was. When she was mentioned in accounts of her more famous relatives, she was a footnote, half dismissed as sickly and sad. Some knew better. John Adams called her journals, which she sent to him, unnecessary of life to me. Her grandson, the great historian Henry Adams, was fascinated by her and thought he might publish some of her papers. He copied hundreds of pages, and it's possible to see their influence in his own work. The first editor of the Adams papers, Lyman C. Butterfield, once wrote, "In the entire span of the Adams dynasty, no figure is more central than the wife of the second Adams statesman, and yet none is less known or more elusive." She was unknown because, for 2 centuries, she was thought to exist outside the bounds of history, those chronicles of deeds and men. She was elusive, too, because she was contradictory about her importance and her family's background, denied her worth, and was quick to describe her doubts. Her character was Quicksilver, and the roles she held were unofficial. She was an American who was foreign-born, a first lady in a country that was not quite her own, and a mother who outlived all but one of her children. She was torn between cultural ideals and strong instincts that she could not ignore. The idea that a woman should wonder about her independent identity, apart from her husband's, apart from her son's, apart from her family, was hardly prevalent or desirable in the time in which she lived. It could be painful, but there was also a kind of freedom in it. The other members of the Adams family took their identity and their duty for granted. They spoke for the ages. She could speak for herself. It became her habit, even her strategy, to define herself as not like the Adamses. And yet, in some larger sense, the Adams family helped instill in Louisa what it helped instill in the young republic, a concern for the value of the individual, a fascination with human nature in its various forms, an awareness of selfish instincts, a suspicion of power, a respect for traditions, and a willingness to scrutinize people, especially oneself. And it was in the letters she exchanged with the Adams family where she found her voice. It was her voice that first struck me. As I read her letters, I thought to myself, who was this other Louisa? They were vivid, propulsive, urgent, often hilarious. She had an eye for the pompous general, the charismatic politician, the dynamics of Washington life, of the battles in the Capitol and in the parlor, where, she once wrote, ladies' wars are always fierce and hot. There was nothing settled, nothing cast in marble or enshrined in posterity about the people she met and the events she witnessed. She witnessed so much. When John Quincy died, some said that in his life one could find the history of the country's first half century. Something like that could be said of her. She was born only months before the start of the Revolution. The year she first arrived in the United States, federal power passed peaceably from the opposition, her father-in-law, for the first time. On the day that her daughter died in St. Petersburg, Moscow was set on fire. When she died, the United States were only a few years away from civil war. Part of the pleasure of writing the book was seeing these events through her amazing giblet eyes. She was born in 1775 in London. Her father was a classic crafty merchant, and her mother was vivacious, charming, socially ambitious. Her parents had secrets, some of which Louisa may have sensed. She spent the American Revolution as a young child living in a luxurious mansion in France, and when the war was over, she returned to London, where she was taught to be a lovely ornament in the language of the day. For the most part, Louisa was raised as young, pretty, wealthy English girls were raised, only she was told to consider herself an American, and much more importantly, to marry one. Her relationship with John Quincy is central to this book. It was sometimes passionate, sometimes tender, sometimes fraught, beginning with their courtship. In 1798, when they wed, he made it clear that he was committed to his country, and in marrying her, he was committing her too. She tried at once to conform and resist it. After their wedding, she and John Quincy went to Berlin, where he was tasked with negotiating a treaty, and she with negotiating a royal court representing a republic who had never been in a republic. When she reached the United States with its democratic pretensions, she would find that navigating this country was much more difficult than learning how to dance with the king. It was harder because there was no room to settle. She lived in London, France, Berlin, Russia, Washington, Boston, Quincy, and traveled extensively. She spent time in apartments, hotels, houses, dachas, cottages, the White House. There were ships, carriages, sleds, coaches, trains, steamboats. It might not be too much to say that for long stretches she lived in trunks and traveling cases. She often felt that she didn't belong. This makes it easy and a little tempting to dwell on what makes her elusive. But Mr. Butterfield was right also to call her central. She was a force, witty and charming, and critical to her husband's diplomatic and political efforts. Abroad, she won favor with kings and queens. At home, she sparred and bantered with leading politicians. She presided over weekly dinners for senators and cabinet members and dignitaries, giving them the cover to talk politics when politics were a dirty word. She set up a kind of campaign headquarters in her parlor one summer in Philadelphia, and she had a series of weekly parties called Tuesdays at Mrs. Adams that made her the dominant social figure in Washington. On the morning before one of these parties, one of the biggest parties, the newspapers all ran a poem. Every stanza ended, "All are gone to Mrs. Adams." That party was actually a pretty brilliant political maneuver in siphoning some of the attention away from Andrew Jackson, who had become the leading candidate while her husband's fortunes were flagging. And it was actually delightful. Downstairs in the manuscript room, there are, in several collections from people from that time, there are copies of the original invitation for that event, which was fun to find. That was in 1824. It was, and it's also striking that so many people saved it. It was her campaign in some ways more than his. At a time of rising popular sentiment and turmoil within the political establishment, she understood that people are governed by emotions as much as laws, and that politics are about people, their little passions and prejudices, their feelings of want and hope. John Quincy did everything he could to hide his feelings. He even refused to campaign for the presidency because he did not want to appear to beg for votes. He lashed himself in his diary for his failings, but outwardly, as his son Charles wrote, he wore an iron mask. She understood something else, a lesson painfully learned. Ambition could have terrible costs. At just the moment John Quincy came into the power of the presidency, she felt most powerless. She was isolated, felt alone, they fought. Their children struggled, their family began to fall apart. When she and her husband returned to Quincy, she believed they had come to live out their days exhausted and grieving, self-questioning, self-flagellating. She thought she'd sacrificed much too much. But she was resilient, and in fact, the Adams' last and greatest act had just begun. While her husband became one of the first great anti-slavery leaders in Congress, she wrestled with what it meant to be a woman, a wife, a self. She thought about how to have faith, what to live for, and why. As fantastic as her adventures were, the real story is of her inner life. Her biography cannot be told like her husband's. It is a history of feelings as well as facts, of questions as well as answers, of doubt as well as certainty. It is a record of a life. It is a narrative of a journey, and it is the adventures not of a nobody, but an extraordinary woman. And I would be happy to answer any questions you all might have. Yes.
I wondered what kind of education did she receive? I mean, I'm assuming it was tutors or something like that, but to hold your own against the Adams, she must have received a formidable education.
Well, it's interesting. This is actually something. The question is about what kind of education she received, and this is something that preoccupied her because she felt the gulf in learning between her and her husband. She went to a boarding school outside of London until she was 14, which was led by a woman, Elizabeth Carter, who was very well read, and she had a couple of very unusual teachers. One of them was a woman who she later described in one of her memoirs as dressing like a man, actually, and who had received a formal classical education as if she had been a boy. She knew Greek and Latin, and introduced her to Milton and Shakespeare, and Louisa was very proud of the fact that when her father gave her a shilling when she was 11, she used it to buy Paradise Lost and a treatise for self-knowledge, which was a popular book at the time. And her letters are just sprinkled with references to Alexander Pope, and she was a great reader. She also had another teacher who was not her formal teacher, but a reverend named John Hewitt, who was actually a leading figure in some of the countercultural circles in London. Interestingly, he was a very good friend of people like John Keats. He was actually the one that mentored Mary Wollstonecraft, and actually took Mary Wollstonecraft's first book, which was about the education of young women, to his own publisher, also by the name of Johnson, actually, and got that published. And he would later become actually the minister to one of the royal family. But and Louisa spent a lot of time with him as a young girl, and she later wrote that her quote was, "He taught me early to think," and that was actually pretty unusual for a woman in that time. In fact, Mary Wollstonecraft's whole revolutionary idea was that girls should be taught to think. This was like really considered radicalism, feminist radicalism at the time. Not obviously, those words were not used, but that actually kind of went into abeyance once she got out of school, mostly for financial reasons. She had a pretty sad education, being taught to dance and embroider and get married, essentially, and run a house. And when she met John Quincy, she actually asked him for a reading list. She said, I want to close the gap between us. And he laughed at her, and that was actually painful for her. And he kind of criticized her reading, and that was one of the issues between them. Later on, she would just devour books, and she wrote about them sometimes. Maria, some of them are people we don't know anymore, like Maria Edgeworth was very popular. Some of them we do, like Sir Walter Scott. But she wrote about, on several occasions, she wrote about Lady Macbeth, sort of interesting people. Hamlet, she wrote about her reading, and she tried to teach herself, especially when this is much too long an answer, but when her kids went to college, went to Harvard, she decided to sort of study alongside them. She tried to learn Latin. She translated Plato, Socrates' Apology from the French, not the Greek. But she was sending these things to John Adams, and he was sort of like, what are you doing? But it reflects, her real desire to learn something that was apparent, I think, as a young child, and then kind of reflowered as in middle age. Yeah.
I was curious, what prompted your interest in writing about Louisa Adams?
Well, I read some of her letters while doing research for someone else on a book, and as I mentioned in my talk, her voice was just totally unusual. It was unlike any of the other people I'd read, especially a lot of the men, these kind of historical, Madison and Jeffersons. They knew that they were writing for their future biographers. They carefully copied their letters. They, kind of left us well-organized archives or messy archives, but they left us things for posterity. And her husband did the same. She did not do that. Half her letters say burn this at the bottom. But she was really kind of writing for herself and for the people that she was communicating with, and there was a kind of freedom to her, not only her voice but also her observations, which was absent in a lot of the things I saw. And so it was so exciting, actually, to kind of encounter this incredible human, amidst what can sometimes be sort of, calcified by myth and even by the best kind of research, somewhat distant. Her voice was like in my ear, and I couldn't really get rid of it. And I read those letters in 2008, so that gives you some sense of how I just couldn't shake them. Yeah.
You hinted a little bit about her relationship with John Adams.
Yeah. Sure. That was
Can you repeat?
the question is about her relationship with John Adams, her father-in-law. And that was extremely close. She had a much more complicated and difficult relationship with Abigail. But John was, as she wrote, a friend from the first instant they met. And he loved her. He once said that marrying Louisa was the best thing. He told someone else that marrying Louisa was the best thing that John Quincy had ever done. And this is actually when he was president. So, Louisa had been sending Abigail kind of diary letters, which was pretty common at the time. And when Abigail died, she stopped writing. And like 3 weeks later, a letter arrives from John Adams saying, "Where are my letters?" And so she picked it up, and they had a really wonderful correspondence. And she sort of stepped into the role that John Adams seemed to have wanted of a, strong, intelligent woman whom he could talk about everything from politics to, what birds were chirping outside his window. And I know they had a wonderful and warm relationship through until he died. Yep.
When Dolly Madison died, there was a great national outpouring of grief. What kind of reaction was there from the nation when Louisa died?
It was actually, the question is about what happened when Louisa died. And it was actually the first time that both the House and Senate shut down for her as a mark of respect and to attend her funeral. That was the first time that had been done for a woman. Her pallbearers were all the kind of leading figures of the day. And there was a great, the whole thing, parade, thunder, cannons. It's actually really interesting. Charles Adams writes in his diary about that day, about the funeral. I don't know if there was the same kind of public outpouring, outside of Washington for Louisa. I think in some ways Louisa was more of a controversial figure than Dolly Madison. I know that is true. Everybody loved Dolly, as Louisa liked to say, with probably a somewhat fake smile on her face. Just as Dolly once wrote of her, "I hear Mrs. Adams is keeping up the dissipations," as if Dolly hadn't been quite the hostess herself. So yeah, she was loved by those who knew her, but she had not been quite as formidable a first lady. She was more of a social force before and after John Quincy was president, but not during the presidency. But Charles wrote about that day, and of how overwhelming it had been, and how he had wanted something actually private. He'd originally thought maybe her pallbearers should just be members of the family and things like that, and then he realized he had to include all these people. But the most striking thing is that he wrote about being amidst this incredible public, big celebration of his mother's life. He said, I've never felt more alone, which was incredibly moving. Thanks.
I've forgotten my history. Was John Quincy Adams, was he the ambassador to Russia?
Well, it's not. Yeah, I'm going to say yes. He was technically not the rank of ambassador. We didn't have an ambassador in those days. He's a minister plenipotentiary, but we can call it ambassador. Yes.
Her religious life?
Very incredibly important to her, and increasingly so as she grew older. The question is about her religious life, and she was, I would say, idiosyncratic in her religious beliefs. As she put it late in her life, I'm not so sure some people don't think I'm a heretic. She had gone to a convent school when she was in France, and really was always drawn to and then had been an Anglican in growing up in London, and was always drawn to the kind of ceremony of the Roman Catholic Church. Actually, she was never a Catholic, but she was definitely more Episcopalian than the Adams family was. She did not like the snuffling and note singing and, at meetings. She thought the fact that they called them church service meetings was terrible. But she sort of also attended any service. When she was in Russia, she was going to Te Deum. She was, she sort of saw it all. And she became very, very religious, especially she had a lot of tragedy in her life. And when she was older, she wrote a lot about God. I mean, she really almost would flip a switch, and start talking about God and suffering in kind of religious terms. And I actually didn't really understand some of her letters until I was reading the Psalms, and I realized that she was really kind of borrowing a lot from some of those metaphors and that language. Yeah.
Can you say something more about the sources? Are the letters here or at the Adams papers?
Both. The Adams papers in the Mass Historical Society are this immense collection. It's like 608. That might not be the exact number, but it's something like that. Reels of microfilm. But there is a set of that microfilm downstairs. There's, I think, like 50 or so of them around the world. And they've also done a really wonderful job of digitizing, much of their collection. So all of John Quincy's diary is not searchable online, but searchable by date, which is amazing. And then downstairs, there's a smaller Adams collection of papers. And then there are also, she's friends with people like the Thorntons, who was a great architect at the time, so they have collections, or Margaret Bayard Smith. I think her papers are here. And so there's a lot of ancillary material here, as well as some original stuff downstairs. And then, you come across things. I mean, I had such a kind of an amazing experience that the Mass Historical Society keeps basically a database of every Adams letter ever written, and it's coded by place and everything. And I came across a huge trove that were not in that database at the Historical Society in Pennsylvania, because it was in, she was very good friends with someone who later became a Supreme Court justice, and so was a man of some import. His papers were there, and there was a box that was called Letters from Ladies, and it had obviously not been opened since they were putting it in. And there were just this pile of letters from Louisa Catherine Adams right in there. So, yeah. Yep.
If you were ever in a position to actually interview her personally, what would be a couple of questions you would ask her?
That's not a question I've ever gotten before, so I'm not prepared for this question. But I guess I would. I'm not so sure. I'm convinced that she's the most reliable narrator of her own life. So it would be interesting to hear what she would say on any number of subjects. But I think I would ask her. There were certain things I wanted to know if she knew. I wanted to know if she knew more about her mother than she let on, or her parents, because I think that actually does change the story a little bit.
Why?
Well, her parents weren't married when she was born, and it's unclear whether or not she knew that. That was actually brought up in the campaign, in the re-election campaign. And there's a lot of mudslinging. We think elections today is bad, and it was incredibly painful to her, and I wonder if she knew whether or not it was true. She once wrote that there was this misconception that her mother was 15 when she first had her first child with Louisa's sister, Nancy. And this has basically kind of undergirded a lot of the scholarship that had been done about Louisa, that Louisa must have known that her mother was this kind of, and if she was 15, she was probably poorly educated or probably lower class, and nothing was known about her mother, really. And there was some sense that Louisa was very insecure about her mother. That's actually not true. It turns out, one of the nice discoveries was to be able to actually find her mother's birth records and things like that in her parish registers. And so her mother was and then reconstruct a map of who her family was and who her father was, and her mother was pretty middle class, was 23, not 15, all these things. So I kind of want to know why she said her mother was 21 when they went to France, which would have made her 15 when they had their first child. I have actually a theory, which is that Louisa was 21 when she went to Prussia, and I think she was just, when she was writing her own account, she was sort of putting herself in her mother's place, or putting her mother in her place. That's complete speculation on my part. That's what I'm saying. Like, that's not in the book. That's me standing up here and coming up with a theory that I can't ever confirm, but that's why I would have to ask her, And I'm not sure she'd tell me the truth. So, but yeah.
So what was her relationship to her family? Did they support her, and did she communicate with the family?
She was very, very close to her sisters. They were her best, and had typical sibling relationships, fraught relationships with them too. She was idolized her father, and that's partly because I think he had some trouble that affected her, and she kind of built him up in her mind in a very defensive way. She had one of the ways in which she kept her sense of herself intact, by being a not Adams, was that she was a Johnson, and she sort of held onto that part of her a little bit tighter than was common at the time. And it's common when you married into the Adams family, it was like it was all consuming, and she kind of kept some distance. And partly that was by, she would sort of write things like, well, my father was a revolutionary hero too. She sort of made a kind of bigger deal out of her bona fides, than she might have otherwise.
How did she meet him?
Her father was the American consul in London, And John Quincy, and his house was known to be a place that was very welcoming to Americans who were visiting London. You know, you come get your mail, you talk business. It was especially known to be welcoming to young American bachelors because he had so many pretty young daughters. And they would come to pick up their mail and then stay for dinner. And then after dinner, there would be singing in the parlor by the young soprano Louisa and the piano player Nancy, and Caroline played the harp. And so their house was very, very social spot. And so John Quincy came one day, brought by John Trumbull, Colonel Trumbull, who has painted all those amazing scenes, who once had a thing for Louisa himself. He kind of went away for a month and then came back night after night after night. And it's actually very funny. He couldn't stay away, and he was so suspicious of pleasure. He was so, in some ways, more Puritan than, Puritan. And he would write in his diary, like, "This is terrible. I have to get away. This is so pleasurable. What's going on? I gotta go." Yep.
That reminds me of John Wesley when John Quincy was president. He embraced the philosophy of John Wesley, which was to get up in the morning at 4 and read the Bible. And in her journal, she wrote that affected their relationship because that was when they had their most pleasant, amorous moments.
Yeah.
And she was bitter toward John Wesley.
Yes, absolutely.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
So let's acknowledge Louisa Thomas. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We promote books and reading at the Center for the Book because we believe they are like the best tools for joy and love and laughter and for time travel. An author was here talking about that a couple weeks back, that we get to travel time and geography and never leave our chair. And you take us to exciting places in your talk and in your book today, and so thank you for doing that. We get a chance to be exposed to cultures unlike our own, and hopefully broaden our minds about who we are in the world because we get to be with people like you and the other Louisa. So thank you for that. I should mention too that the books are for sale in the back, so we welcome you to, if you've not already purchased your copy, to do so, and to thank you for being here. Again, we mentioned the webcast recording of this talk and many others are available online at read.gov, and we welcome you to view those as well, and we welcome you back. We're actually here next week on November 10th for our next Book and Beyond talk, and we thank you for being here today. What is the topic next week? The designer of DC, and I don't have the name in front of me.
it's about how Spain and France and England helped actually.
Yes, the design of DC, the building of DC is shame on me for not having it, right? But the influence of Spain and France and on the design and building of DC. And I will have the talk online, as a matter of fact. So you can visit us at read.gov and see our schedule there. Thanks so much for being here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.